welcome to the SE Podcast. I'm your host, Justin McRoberts, and I'm also my very own guest. Earlier this year, we made a bit of a switch, moving away from having guests on the podcast, at least for a season, and moving directly into conversation with you about the things that matter most to you, that I'm the captain now. The reason we had started the podcast at all, the reason I was hosting guests was that there were issues and topics, and there was turbulence in the waters that we were sailing together, as it were, and I found it helpful to ask people who were in professional positions or positions of leadership and power how they were navigating these waters, and I hope that they would help you and I navigate. And it just seems more appropriate, at least for a season, that you and I have that conversation more directly. So this podcast series has shifted into this Q&A, Q&R form. And the way that happens is if you have a question about faith, about religion, about art, creativity, leadership, I take questions at Instagram once a week, usually on a Tuesday. And I answer some of those questions by text, and then I take a few of them and I bring them right here to the podcast and dig a little bit deeper. So this week's questions, I'm going to give you three, and they kind of span the sort of art, leadership, and religion metric, or what's the word there? It's it goes like this. You know what the word is? You're probably saying it right now. It's a scale. It's a sliding scale. It's whatever. They covers all of the bases. That's what I'm saying. This first question about religion and about the practice of religion. This person says, thoughts on being members at a church community. Is it necessary and is it important? The way I wrote it back is I said community is essential. We can't live healthily and wise by ourselves. And then I said Sunday service attendance and or membership can be a way to do that, but it should never be taught as the only way. I want to go a little deeper into this and maybe get a little bit toothier. I know that this person asked a question about membership at a church. And then I kind of moved away from that and talked about community. And here's why. The question I'm hearing, the thing I'm picking up on in coaching conversations and as I travel and get in contact with folks about the practice of religion, has mostly to do with belonging and community. That the deepest question is how to belong to one another. Now, in theory and in hope, a church community is a place in which we can belong and do belong and choose to belong to and with one another across division, across misunderstanding, across disagreement. I think that's something that the soul longs for. I think that's something that's just a deep longing for the human soul, period, regardless of religious affiliation or theology or whatever. I think there's something in us deeply, collectively, almost universally, that desires on a need level to connect with people with whom we don't fully agree. Here's the trick. Far too many, maybe not a majority, far too many religious communities, specifically Christian communities. I'm only saying that because that's the world I'm familiar with. I don't travel among mosques, and so I don't know how it works with Muslims per se. But far too many Christian communities are predicated on agreement. That at the door, we belong to one another because we agree on these theological principles. We agree on these political principles. And if we agree theologically and if we agree politically, well, now we belong. That agreement is a predication of, it's a predication of belonging together. We have to agree. And if we don't agree, then we can't belong. Too many Christian communities are set up that way. And what ends up happening is when there is disagreement, and by the way, there will always be disagreement, because if you're in relationship with someone, one of the gifts of relationship is the best, the worst, and the truest, and whatever of you comes to the surface. Things you didn't even know you thought, and then coming to the surface. And if you're in a relationship with people, you get exposed over time. You get exposed for who you actually are, what you actually think. which makes agreement a terrible predication for actual community. And because so many church communities in the United States of America are predicated on agreement, not just theological, but political agreement, it makes these spaces not just unsafe, but entirely unsound and awful soil for like a soul level communal experience. You can hear the critique. And it grieves me deeply because this is where we should be better. This is 100% where we should be better. And we're going to continue to see churches lose not just numbers, but lose cultural traction until and unless we decide to lose some of these stupid arguments that we're having, to lose some of these ridiculous cultural battles we're in, and get back to the business of actually creating space for us to belong and be held together by the love of God and not what we think about the love of God. Last note on this, it is a misnomer. It's a misstatement to say that churches are divided by issues. And this comes up a lot, and this is part of why I'm saying what I'm saying about community being essential and attendance or what have you being secondary. Churches, communities, people are not actually divided by, not split apart by issues. Issues don't have the power to do that. Will does. In other words, what divides a community of persons is not an issue or the power of an issue. It is the lack of desire to stay together across difference. That's it. The lack of will and desire to stay together with people with whom we disagree is the thing that divides churches. All the issue does is it gives us a stage upon which to voice our disagreement and to voice our desire to no longer live life with certain people. Issues don't divide people. The will to not belong to people with whom we disagree is what divides people. So we are in a cultural moment in which there is a deep longing for actual community, for belonging, and specifically for belonging across distance. And as we are structured now, far too many of our Christian communities are not set up to accommodate or make room for that need, because you have to come to the doorway of agreement politically, theologically, and socially in order to be in that space. That's tragic, and at some point I hope it turns. Second question is kind of, I would suggest, a leadership question, even though the word faith is involved. And this person asks, tips on sharing your faith. This is a great story that it's not my story, but it was told on this podcast really early. In fact, it was one of the very first, if not the first, podcast episodes. We had Jean Lewin Yang, who is a phenomenal graphic novelist and writer, on the podcast, and he was talking about being a person of faith in college and learning this. Like, he wanted to be someone who represented Jesus and talked about God, and didn't know how to do it publicly, was kind of wrestling with how to do it even with his work. And he had a professor who, during his office hours, he went to this professor's office hours and sat down and said to her, they didn't share the faith. I think she might have been a person of faith of some kind, but they didn't share a Christian faith. And he said to them, might have been a woman, I think. But anyways, he said, I'm struggling to share my faith in my work, in my writing. I want to be writing about my faith, and I don't really know how to do that without making it inauthentic or cheesy. And she initially said, don't share your faith. Don't write it. I think she said, don't write about your faith, is what she said. Don't write about your faith. And as he tells a story, he's a masterful storyteller. As he tells the story, like, oh, that's kind of a bummer. Like, maybe you're having this professor who's like, hey, we're not talking about religion here. She goes, don't write about your faith. Then she says this. She says, write about your life. And if your faith is real and authentic, it'll show up. The question about sharing our faith too often is kind of underpinned by this idea that my faith is a thing, is an aspect of my life, as opposed to the way I go about living the entirety of my life. If my faith is this thing I have, like a gift or like a briefcase, if my faith is like this, it's like a thing I can handle and like kind of share or not share, then I think I might have missed the boat on the conversation in general. The way I answer the question is live so well, give so generously, and love so wildly that people ask what makes you tick. That's not methodology. That's sort of, I'm pushing back on the idea that one's faith is something that we can either hide or lift up. I would suggest that at the point at which we're asking, how do I go about sharing my faith, we might have already lost the battle a little bit and need to reorient our posture. My faith ought to be, I want my faith, let's say it like this, I want my faith to be a thing that is evident, that is clear, and that is available to anyone who wants any piece of it or wants to ask any sort of question about it. I don't want my faith to be something I'm trying to insert into conversations. I don't want to have to strategize how to bring up a conversation or a set of conversations that allow me to say a certain number of things or a certain list of things so that I can then feel like I'm sharing my faith. I want the sharing of my faith to be something that is fundamental, that is rooted in my skin. So live so well, give so generously, and love so wildly that people ask what makes you tick. Not so that they will ask, but because living generously, living well, giving generously, and loving wildly is your faith. Just be that person. And let's see what happens on the other side of that. Last piece here, and this is about the practice of our last question, how to discern when to persevere and versus when to let go of a project, a relationship, or a situation. So how to discern like when to persevere and push through and keep working. We had a question very much like this last week, versus when to let go of a project, a relationship, or a situation. So I'm going to cover a few of these, project, relationship, and I don't know exactly what we mean by situation, but we'll kind of get into it as best I can. So with an artistic project, I speak to this oftentimes with artists, that if I'm questioning whether or not to keep going with a project, that probably that means it means usually more than we think it does, and it doesn't always just mean that we're bored. It also doesn't always mean that the project isn't working. It does mean it's time to hit pause and actually do a little self-investigation. Okay, why do I not want to do this anymore? So I say it like this, that one of the primary metrics for discernment when it comes to whether I persevere and stick with it or quit and move on is joy. Am I experiencing joy? And here's what I mean by it is if it's difficult and if I'm having a really hard time, but I can envision coming to the end of the project and knowing that I'll experience joy. If I know that, like, yes, I'm going to feel amazing, and I'm going to be very proud of myself. I'm going to be proud of the project. Like, I know that I'll experience joy if I can get through this thing. It's just really hard right now. That's one thing. But if I can kind of envision that I'm going to get to the end of this thing and then just move on, like I just need to be done and just get away from this thing, and I don't care anymore. That's a whole different thing. At some point in a project, we should lose some emotional connection with it. Like you shouldn't care. You shouldn't, we shouldn't make our projects precious the whole time. But there should be a deep enough emotional connection with a project that even in the hardest part of the project's development, I envision the joy of completion, or I envision the joy of it being in someone's life, or I envision the joy of people celebrating me for it. If I lose touch with that, it's seriously time to think about moving on. This is obviously a question that's easier to navigate with someone else who can dig into some of those particular things. So this is very much a coaching question that I would need to talk through some of the specifics, like where are you in the project? What are the things that are difficult? Is this about difficulty, or is there something about the project that maybe you should have never started to begin with? So this is definitely a coaching question. Feel free to reach out if this is something that's stirring in you. But you will hear me ask about your level of degree of joy if we have this conversation. When it comes to relationships, how to discern when to persevere versus when to let go. So one is this should always be a bit of a two-way street. And oftentimes when we come to what seems to be a dead end in our relationships, one of our patterns, this is a trained pattern, one of our patterns is to isolate that I am the person in the relationship having an issue, I'm having the hardest time or having a hard time. And we don't And I internalize it, and I wonder in my own space over here if I should quit on this relationship, or am I going to persevere? I think the invitation available there is to actually put that on the table and say outright, this is my experience right now. This is how I'm experiencing you. This is how I'm experiencing me in relationship to you. And if this continues to go this way, I don't think I want to do it anymore. I'm questioning whether or not I can stay here. I put this in roommate parameters, like a roommate scenario. Oftentimes, it's like if I'm living with someone who's just a roommate. Roommates are easier than primary relationships. Sometimes, if I'm living with a roommate and something about the way this roommate is living, or several things are driving me crazy, the responsible thing to do is to actually sit down with a roommate. And we do these roommate conversations oftentimes, don't we? Like sit down and say, hey, Tommy, listen, like it's 1 a.m. You're coming in super late. It's 2 a.m. You're coming in super late. You're making a lot of noise. You're bringing people over that like we don't know, we don't really trust. There are people spending that on the couch. We don't know who they are. Like this isn't working. Are you willing to make some changes and actually have the conversation to give that person the opportunity to say, yeah, I see that, but I'm not changing. Or give the opportunity for that person to say like, I'm sorry, you're right. I'm behaving like an idiot. Ending a relationship should be a thing we agree on as best as possible. And so voicing, full throat voicing, this is not working, and why. This is not working for me, and why is that's the step. And the way we know, a way we can know it's time to like actually hit the brakes on a relationship would be one, we voice our grievances or the difference, and the person on the other side of the conversation says, I don't care. Or the person on the other side of the conversation says, you're right, this isn't working. And we can come to an amicable agreement like, yeah, this thing is not going the way we want it to. That provides some clarity. So I hope that's relatively clear with regards to relationships. I don't know about situations, depending on the situation. Both those things are hard. And this and with regards to like ending a thing versus persevering. It's one of the reasons I do what I do as a coach is because the metrics we are trained to use when it comes to perseverance versus working through things are not always great metrics. They're not always and they're not always great tools. And if you are in a place in your life now in which you're looking at a project, a relationship, or maybe a few areas of your life that have this smell on them, like I don't know if I'm supposed to keep going or cut ties and move on, message me, hit me at justinmcroberts.com, and let's set up a session to work through this. These things are important, which brings me back to the beginning of the answer. I would suggest that in all of these things, in all of these obstacles about whether we should persevere or move on, the question has to do with the joy we're experiencing. Not because the goal of life is to be happy, but because joy is the way we talk about you being a fully flourishing human being. And what the world needs more of is not people who push through and accomplish, or people who just endure. What the world needs more of is people who are living in fullness, in living like that full life that Jesus offers. So in these moments, the invitation here is to dig through and figure out like how do I go about pursuing my joy so that I can live the full life that I've been invited into, which then means that I energize everything around me. So thank you. Great questions this week. We'll do it again next week. Thank you for your time. See you again next time.